Been a bit of a shock. However much one tries to prepare oneself for something like this, it's still a dreadful shock, and we're still trying to come to terms with that.
There are moments inside royal life that no protocol can contain. Moments when a father stops being a duke, stops being a working royal, stops being the careful, dependable younger brother who never causes trouble, and becomes something far more powerful. A man who has simply had enough. That moment came quietly. No cameras were summoned. No press statement was prepared. Prince Edward, Duke of Edinburgh, walked through the doors of the Royal Records Chamber with his daughter, Lady Louise Windsor, at his side, and in doing so, he sent a message to the entire palace that even the most composed members of the royal family have a line they will not allow anyone to cross. But to understand why that walk mattered, why it shook the corridors of power and landed on front pages across Britain, you need to know what had been done in the dark before Edward stepped into the light. This is the full story, and it is more unsettling than anything the palace originally wanted you to know. The record that should have been routine. Lady Louise Windsor had done everything right. Everything. For years, she had existed at the edges of royal life in precisely the way her parents, Prince Edward and Sophie, had always intended. No premature titles. No manufactured spotlight, no leveraging of her family name for influence or platform before she had earned the right to carry that weight. While her generation of younger royals attracted tabloid attention and public speculation, Louise had remained something rare inside a monarchy that often struggles to produce it. A young woman who understood that belonging to the crown did not entitle her to anything except the opportunity to serve. So when the time came for Louise's formal entry into the royal records, the protected royal register that preserves family status, ceremonial standing, historic duties, and future recognition. There was no drama anticipated, no controversy expected. This was supposed to be a quiet administrative confirmation, the kind of morning that ends with a signature, a handshake, and a quiet sense that the right thing had been done. Every page had been prepared. Every line was in order. Louise had reached this threshold through patience, discipline, and years of quiet service that most royals twice her age would struggle to match. And then Camilla's message arrived. The request behind closed doors. Prince Edward read it alone. The message from the Queen Consort was not shouted. It was not dramatic. In the world of palace correspondence, requests like this are never delivered with visible menace. They arrive wrapped in the soft language of administration, dressed as concern, presented as caution. Camilla wanted Louise's formal entry postponed, indefinitely, with the possibility, implied, never guaranteed, that the process might resume at some future point that remained conveniently undefined. The documents were to pass through a palace aide. Edward himself was to be kept away from the signing. Read that again slowly. The father of the young woman whose name was being entered into a royal register, a man who had devoted his entire adult life to the crown with a loyalty so steady it had become almost invisible, was being told to step back from his own daughter's recognition. And here is the question that should be sitting uncomfortably in your mind right now. Why would Camilla want to postpone something so routine? What threat could a young woman's administrative registration possibly represent to anyone? That answer begins 3 weeks earlier, and it begins not with politics or scheming, but with an elderly veteran who stumbled. The moment that changed everything. St. George's Chapel at Windsor carries a weight that very few buildings in Britain can match. It is the royal church where history breathes between the stone pillars, and every ceremony leaves a permanent impression on the monarchy's memory. When a senior royal steps into that space, they are not simply attending a service. They are participating in a living institution. The remembrance ceremony that afternoon was expected to be restrained. Charles arrived with the measured authority of a king performing a duty he understands deeply. Camilla stood where the attention of the room naturally gathered, among the senior royals whose position required them to be visible. Prince Edward and Sophie stood nearby with Louise, who had come simply to support her parents. She had been given no role. She had asked for none. She was never supposed to become the moment everyone remembered. The veteran moved forward to sign the memorial book, the formal volume in which honored guests record their attendance at commemorative occasions. Then his balance failed. His medals case fell, He began to go down, and in the fraction of a second before any aide could react, Lady Louise was already moving. She steadied him. She recovered his fallen medals case. She remained quietly at his side until he was safely seated. The act lasted less than a minute. It was completely unplanned, entirely human, and required no instruction from anyone. Then the congregation rose. Spontaneous applause filled St. George's Chapel, and for a brief moment, Lady Louise Windsor became the emotional center of a royal occasion she had never been scheduled to occupy. Charles watched with quiet approval. Edward felt pride break through his usual restraint. Sophie saw something else. She was watching Camilla. The Queen Consort's expression remained controlled, perfectly managed, the kind of composure that takes years inside royal life to construct and maintain. But Sophie noticed what the composure was working to contain. Camilla's fingers tightened around the service program as the broadcaster praised Louise's dignity. Her jaw was set. Her eyes tracked the young woman with a calculation that had nothing to do with admiration. Camilla understood, with absolute clarity, what that applause meant. Lady Louise had not been positioned as a rising star. She had not sought a platform or arranged a moment. She had simply responded to another human being in distress, and in doing so had reminded the public of something the monarchy occasionally forgets to demonstrate, that belonging to the crown could look like this: quiet, disciplined, real. That kind of naturalness is more powerful than any managed public appearance, and power inside royal life always gets noticed when admiration becomes suspicion. Prince Edward encountered Camilla later that evening in a private corridor of Windsor. The conversation that followed was brief, controlled on her side, and deeply disturbing on his. She asked whether Louise was being positioned for a greater role. He stared at her. He was stunned by the question and what it revealed about how his daughter's instinctive act of compassion had been reinterpreted in the hours since the chapel. He answered plainly. His daughter had helped someone who was falling. That was the entirety of it. Camilla replied coldly that within royal life, even instinct could become strategy. He walked away disturbed, but he did not yet understand how quickly suspicion had become action. Within hours of that applause, not days, not weeks, but hours, a confidential staff account later documented that Camilla had instructed her private secretary to obtain the timetable for Louise's entry into the royal records. She had already begun identifying the mechanism through which the young woman's recognition could be controlled. Think about what that means. A spontaneous act of human kindness, a young woman helping a veteran who had stumbled, had been processed by someone inside the palace as a threat requiring an administrative response before the day was out. Can you imagine arriving at that conclusion about your own niece? Does the word threat belong anywhere in the same sentence as Lady Louise Windsor? The alteration. When Prince Edward finally arrived at the records chamber with Louise and was handed copies of the prepared documentation, he noticed something that should not have been there. A handwritten notation beside Louise's name. A coded restriction whose wording carried an authority no ordinary clerk could invent. He looked at the page. He looked at the uneasy faces around it. He understood immediately that Camilla's message had never been the whole picture. Someone higher had already reached into his daughter's future. A records clerk approached him privately and disclosed, through a documented chamber log, that Louise's page had been altered twice within 48 hours. The first version contained standard, unremarkable language. The second, the version currently sitting in the register, limited 3 specific things: Louise's ceremonial inclusion, her access to family archives, and her ability to represent the crown at future public engagements. Sophie fell silent when those details reached her, because she remembered something. Camilla had recently asked her, in what had seemed like casual conversation, whether Louise might ever represent Charles at youth events, equestrian occasions, or remembrance engagements. At the time, the question had sounded like simple curiosity. It had not been curiosity, it had been reconnaissance. But the detail that made Edward's hands tighten around the copied pages, the detail that moved this beyond administrative interference into something that could only be described as betrayal, was the authorization code. The amendment carried Charles's private royal authorization code. The king's own authority had been used to restrict his niece's future. Whether he had understood what he was signing, or whether his trust had been abused by someone who knew how to bury a damaging clause inside a bundle of routine paperwork, was the question that now hung over everything. And it was the question Edward had to answer before another hour passed. The confrontation with Camilla. Camilla expected Edward to come seeking an explanation. She had handled enough palace situations to know that explanations, carefully delivered, can drain the urgency from almost any grievance. What she did not expect was that he would arrive carrying the altered record. When the door closed and the aides remained outside, the polite architecture of monarchy, the careful language, the deference, the deliberate management of tone, disappeared entirely. Edward placed both versions of his daughter's page on the table between them. The original, the altered document. She sat comfortably. She spoke without apparent anxiety. She had prepared this position. He did not sit. The Queen Consort's answer revealed the architecture of her concern with unusual clarity. She argued that the monarchy could not survive uncontrolled expectations, that the public focus had to remain on a narrow group of senior royals, that unexpected popularity, the kind that grows organically from a single unplanned moment in a chapel, could create duties, demands, and rival centers of influence that the institution was not prepared to manage. Edward understood the pressure beneath that argument. The strain on a reduced working royal family is real. The relentless judgment is real. The institutional anxiety about the line of succession and public engagement is real. He understood all of it. What he could not accept was the cruelty hidden inside the logic. Louise had asked for nothing. She had demanded nothing. She had simply existed with grace and responded to a moment of human need with the instinct her parents had spent years teaching her to trust. And the Queen Consort was treating her, as a complication. When Camilla described Louise as a possible complication, something in Edward finally fractured. He told her directly that a young woman could not be protected by being quietly diminished. She accused him of allowing paternal pride to override royal judgment. He told her she was using royal judgment to disguise personal insecurity. The words struck with brutal clarity. For the first time in their conversation, Camilla's composure broke, and then she admitted it. She confirmed, through their recorded private exchange, that she had requested the postponement. She denied responsibility for the specific restrictions in the final amendment, insisting those appeared only after she had discussed Louise's position with Charles. That admission changed everything Edward thought he understood about what he was facing. The question he could not avoid. Either Charles had approved the language himself, fully understanding what it meant, or he had allowed his royal authority to be used by someone he trusted, without questioning the consequences. Neither answer was comfortable. One meant his brother had knowingly restricted his niece. The other meant the king had become so accustomed to avoiding conflict with his wife that he had signed away a young woman's future without reading what he was approving. Edward gathered the pages and walked toward the door. Camilla offered one final warning. Confronting Charles could force the monarch to choose between his wife and his brother. He did not answer, because he already understood that the choice had begun the moment someone altered that page. Charles sat alone in his private study when Edward entered. The copied amendment was placed on the desk between them. Charles read it without speaking. He removed his glasses and set them carefully beside the document, and the silence that followed was the kind that carries its own confession. Edward asked whether Charles considered Louise a threat. The king rejected the word immediately. He explained that the restriction was intended to prevent obligations his niece might later resent, duties she hadn't asked for and might not want. Edward's disappointment hardened into something colder. He answered that Louise should be allowed to decide what she resented. No one had the right to narrow her identity before she had chosen her own path, especially a young woman who had never demanded a title, a position, or a single additional moment of public attention. And then Charles admitted the thing that made the entire affair impossible to excuse. Camilla had warned him about Louise's growing popularity after the chapel. She had told him that unexpected public affection could disrupt the planned hierarchy, the carefully controlled order of which royals received duties, attention, and institutional prominence. He had signed a bundle of recommendations without reading every final line. His niece's future had been reduced to one paragraph buried among routine papers, and he had approved it without looking. But the cruelest detail came last. The amendment did not merely limit Louise's future public appearances. It blocked her access to sections of the family archives connected to Prince Philip's private legacy, the letters, the training notes, the personal documents that preserved her grandfather's voice, the man who had taken her love of carriage driving seriously when others treated it as a quiet hobby, the man who had treated her as someone worth investing in. Charles looked stricken when he understood what his careless signature had nearly taken from her. The truth reaches Louise. Sophie and Edward had agreed on one thing before they spoke to their daughter. Louise would hear the truth from them, unfiltered, before she faced anyone else. They would not allow palace officials to soften the language until its cruelty had been edited into something easier to dismiss. When Sophie finally told her about the archive restriction, about Philip's letters, his notes, the private collection that connected Louise to the grandfather who had understood her best, Louise did not cry immediately. She sat down. She removed her gloves. She stared at her hands, and then she asked who had decided she had not earned the right to remember him. That question should sit with every person watching this right now, because this was not about titles. This was not about public prominence or institutional politics or the complex mechanics of a working monarchy. This was about a young woman being separated from the private memory of her grandfather through a coded administrative amendment that was never meant to reach her eyes. Someone had taken Louise's most personal inheritance and used it as a lever to control what she might become. She read the altered document twice at Bagshot Park. She placed it across her lap and stared at her hands. Her first emotion, she would later describe, was not rage. It was disbelief, followed by a question she asked her mother that revealed exactly how much damage had been done beneath the surface. She asked whether the applause at the chapel had made people believe that every kind action she might ever perform would be treated as planned, whether instinct had now become evidence against her. Sophie moved closer and told her something true, that another person's fear could not transform her kindness into manipulation, that she had helped that veteran because he was falling, not because cameras were watching. But the reassurance could not reach the deeper wound, because the wound was not about one incident. It was about what it meant for everything that came after. If sincere compassion could be reinterpreted as ambition by the people closest to the crown, then Louise now understood something about the institution she belonged to that she could never fully unknow. Edward apologized for not recognizing the danger sooner. Louise looked directly at her father and asked him something that silenced the room. She asked whether he had escorted her into the chamber because she deserved to be there, or because he had wanted to defeat Camilla. He had no immediate answer. He admitted that anger had driven him through the door, but love had made him stay beside her. His honesty changed something between them. She no longer needed him to speak on her behalf. She declared that she would meet Charles without either parent in the room. She would meet Camilla directly, not to punish the Queen, but to make her hear, in her own words, face to face, what the restriction would have erased. Before she left for that meeting, Louise retrieved one small item from her dresser, the carriage driving pin that Prince Philip had given her. She fastened it to her coat. Edward had walked his daughter into this fight as a protective father, but in the moment she fastened that pin, he understood that she had decided to end it entirely on her own terms. The meeting that no protocol could script. There were no secretaries in the room, no prepared statements, no ceremonial chairs arranged to reflect rank and hierarchy. Lady Louise had requested a family conversation, and she meant the word deliberately. Not a royal audience with all the distance that formal protocol creates between honest human beings. A conversation where the only protection anyone had was the truth. Charles received Louise and Camilla together. Prince Edward and Sophie waited outside at their daughter's specific request. She had not asked them to remain behind because she was uncertain. She had asked it because she was certain enough to do this alone. Louise turned to Camilla first. She asked her calmly and without accusation whether the applause inside the chapel had frightened her. Camilla denied it. She called the restriction a safeguard against confusion. She used the institutional language of managed expectations and controlled royal hierarchies. Louise did not argue. She did not raise her voice or reach for emotion as a weapon. She simply asked the same question again, and this time Camilla's silence said more than her previous answer had. The Queen Consort finally acknowledged what the careful language had been constructed to conceal. She admitted that sudden public affection, the organic, unmanaged kind that attaches to a person rather than a position, could disturb the planned structure of royal roles, that it could create expectations around someone the palace had not prepared to place at the center. Louise's response was measured and final. She told Camilla that she had never wanted to replace anyone. She had never wanted to be placed at any center. She wanted the freedom to help when help was genuinely needed. And she wanted to remain connected to Prince Philip's legacy, not as political power, but as private memory, as a bond between a grandfather and a granddaughter that had nothing to do with institutional standing and everything to do with the hours they had spent together. Camilla had no answer that could absorb that, because Louise had offered nothing she could dismiss as ambition, no hunger for status, no anger she could reframe as a calculated attack, just a young woman asking quietly for the right to exist honestly within her own family's history. Louise then asked to speak with Charles alone. Camilla left. The door closed, and the balance of the room changed completely. Louise told her uncle that she required no promises, no titles, no appointment to any public role she had not asked for. She asked only that he remove language written from fear and allow her record to reflect what she had actually done, rather than predict what others had imagined she might become. Charles admitted that he had signed the restriction without reading its final wording. He admitted that avoiding conflict with Camilla had become easier than examining every consequence of the papers placed in front of him. He looked at his niece and said what needed to be said, not as a sovereign addressing a subject, but as an uncle who had failed a member of his own family. He apologized. Then he lifted his fountain pen, crossed through the restriction, and summoned the keeper of the records to witness the correction. The photograph that stopped Britain. The palace had hoped to contain this. That is the single most important thing to understand about what happened next. Every institution that operates behind closed doors believes, at some fundamental level, that what happens inside those doors can be managed before it reaches the public, that the right statement, issued at the right moment, can reframe any narrative before it takes root. They were wrong. By morning, Britain was not debating an archival amendment. Prince Edward stepping through the entrance to the records chamber, Lady Louise Windsor beside him, his hand held protectively behind her shoulder, palace officials watching from the doorway with expressions that required no caption. The image contained no shouting, no visible confrontation, no dramatic gesture, yet millions of people who saw it understood its meaning without a single word of explanation. A father had been told to step back. He had walked forward instead, with his daughter. The newspaper headline that stopped Windsor the next morning carried no complex analysis. Beneath the photograph, it printed 4 words: her name, his stand. That was enough. Because sometimes the truest things are also the simplest. An evening broadcaster described what Edward had done as a rare royal rebellion conducted without a single public word. The phrase spread rapidly, because it captured his defiance with absolute precision while refusing to transform Louise into a political fighter she had never chosen to become. Her silence looked dignified. His refusal looked deliberate. Together, they told a story that no palace statement could overwrite. What made the photograph so devastating for the palace was not simply what it showed, it was what it made people feel. In an era when royal imagery is so carefully managed, every walkabout timed, every public smile positioned for maximum institutional benefit, there is something almost violent about an image that no communications team planned or approved. The body language between Edward and Louise told a story that press releases cannot manufacture. His posture was not that of a duke performing a duty. It was that of a man protecting someone he loved from an institution that had briefly forgotten it was supposed to protect her too. Royal watchers who had followed Edward's career for decades noted something they had rarely seen from him. Not anger, not calculation, certainty. The kind that only arrives when a person has finally stopped weighing the cost of doing what is right against the benefit of keeping the peace. Edward had spent a lifetime as the quietest Windsor. the most dependable, the one who never created problems. And in walking through that door with his daughter, he had demonstrated something the monarchy had perhaps underestimated about quiet people. When they finally move, they mean it entirely. Social media accelerated what the morning papers had begun, and spread alongside the photograph of Edward at the chamber entrance. The juxtaposition was impossible to ignore. A young woman whose instinctive decency had been punished through coded administrative language, and a father who had refused to pretend that was acceptable. Comment sections that royal stories rarely generate filled within hours. People who had never previously followed the internal dynamics of the Windsor family found themselves invested in the outcome of one young woman's right to sign her own name in a register. The contrast made the story impossible to contain, and it raised a question that lingered uncomfortably above every palace statement that followed. If this had never been discovered, if that records clerk had not approached Edward privately, if the chamber log had not been preserved, if Edward had accepted the postponement without pushing back, would Louise ever have known what had been written beside her name? Would she have understood why certain doors seemed slightly harder to open? Why certain invitations arrived slightly less often? Why the grandfather's archive she had expected to inherit felt somehow further away than it should have been? The palace's silence on that question was, in its own way, the most honest answer it gave. Sophie watched the coverage at home with a fear that only a mother could fully understand. She worried that strangers would accuse Louise of ambition, that they would blame her for dividing the family, that the institution's failure would be reframed as the young woman's fault. And then something happened outside St. George's Chapel that changed the entire tenor of the public response. A small group of people gathered. They carried carriage-driving ribbons. A tribute, spontaneous, unorganized, and precisely chosen, to the bond between Lady Louise Windsor and Prince Philip. The public had understood what the restriction had threatened to erase. Not a royal role, not a title, not a position, a granddaughter's right to remember her grandfather. The final reckoning. Charles issued a formal Buckingham Palace clarification, stating that Louise's record contained no restrictions and that her family legacy remained fully recognized. Camilla's name appeared nowhere in the statement. That silence became its own verdict. The palace knew revised paperwork could not heal what secrecy had broken. So Charles did something more difficult. He summoned Edward, Sophie, Louise, and Camilla to one final family meeting where responsibility would be named clearly, and Louise's place within the monarchy's continuing story would be settled without evasion. Charles opened by confirming that every restriction had been permanently removed. Louise's entry in the royal records would recognize her full family status, restore her complete access to Prince Philip's private archive, and preserve her right to accept future duties freely, if and only if she chose them for herself. He then changed the approval process for the future. No restriction affecting a named royal could ever again be buried inside bundled recommendations. Groups of documents presented for a single signature, without each consequence receiving individual attention. The person affected and their immediate family would have to be formally informed before any decision became final. Correcting one page meant nothing if the system that had allowed the injustice was left intact around it. Charles placed the corrected register on the table and turned it toward Louise. She read every line. Philip's carriage driving pin was still fastened to her coat. Then she signed beneath her name. Edward stood beside her. He did not guide her hand. He did not speak. This decision belonged entirely to his daughter, and every person in that room understood it. Camilla acknowledged that she had treated public affection as a threat and mistaken modesty for hidden strategy. She apologized without offering a defense. Louise accepted the apology, and then said something that carried more weight than any formal statement the palace would later release. She said that forgiveness could never require silence about what had happened. Not a threat, not an ultimatum, a boundary, stated calmly by a young woman who had every right to draw it. Edward told Louise that escorting her into the records chamber had been the proudest act of his royal life. Not because he had defeated anyone, because he had finally refused to let loyalty become submission. Charles delivered the institutional conclusion. A smaller monarchy cannot survive by making loyal relatives feel disposable. Its strength comes from trust, character, and service, not from shrinking the circle whenever one person's quiet popularity unsettles someone else's sense of control. What Louise carried out of that room. Lady Louise Windsor left the final meeting without a new title, without a dramatic promotion, without any of the things that royal public life tends to measure as success. She left with her name preserved honestly, her grandfather's legacy restored to her without condition, and her future returned to her own hands, to shape on her own terms, without someone else's fear written into the margin beside her name. That is the story. A young woman helped a veteran who was falling. The applause that followed frightened someone with the authority to act on that fear. And a father refused, quietly, deliberately, without a single public word, to allow the institution to make his daughter apologize for the kind of person she had always been. The monarchy is built on continuity, on the idea that each generation inherits something worth passing forward. But what Prince Edward protected inside that records chamber was not a title or a ceremonial role or an institutional position. He protected the record of who his daughter actually is, and he forced the crown to acknowledge that the truth about Lady Louise Windsor is not something that belongs to anyone else to manage, restrict, or define. The register is closed now. Her name is there, exactly as it should be, permanently restored by a father who understood that real loyalty, the kind that costs something, sometimes means finding the courage to say no. If this story moved you, share it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of royal life that the palace hoped would stay behind closed doors.